Hi everybody, and welcome back to SFC's Food for Thought series. My name is Hannah, and I am going into my third year at U of C in natural science, third of many years. With me today is Kira and Ryan. Kira, if you want to give yourself a little introduction, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Kira. I graduated from chemical engineering at Queen's in 2020. I worked in the oil and gas industry for 2 years, and now I work for Canada Action and SFC. Ryan, do you want to give your intro?
Absolutely. So I'm going into fourth year studying criminology and political science at the University of Ottawa, and I've been with SFC since January.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. So for those of you who are just seeing SFC for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals, and we believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please feel free to connect with us at any time on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All of them are at Students for Canada if you want to learn more about what we do. Joining us today is Bryan Gould. Bryan is President and CEO of Aspenleaf Energy Limited, which is a privately held oil company backed by ARC Financial and Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Aspenleaf operates assets in the Swan Hills, Leduc and Twining regions of Alberta, having acquired Arcan Resources Ltd in 2015, NEP Canada Ltd in 2018, and Huron Resources Corporation in 2020. Bryan was born and raised in Toronto. He attended the University of Toronto and graduated in 1982 with a Master of Applied Science in Chemical Engineering. And upon graduation, he joined Shell Canada as a reservoir engineer and moved west to Calgary. His experience in development and operations of conventional oil and gas assets, oil sands, and unconventional resource plays. Bryan is a seasoned oil and gas executive with more than 25 years of experience with Royal Dutch Shell and Shell Canada, and more than 3 years with Athabasca Oil Corporation. He's a track record in strategy implementation and has completed over $20 billion in transactions, including corporate and asset acquisitions and sales and joint ventures with large international organizations. Bryan is an active advocate for the Canadian energy sector and is currently chair of the CAP Industry Reputation Priority Steering Group and is also chair of the CAP Conventional CEO Council. Bryan is married with 2 children, and his personal interests include gardening, running, and reading. So before I hand the floor over, please know that attendees are encouraged to ask questions at any time using the Q&A box below, and we'll address all of them at the end of the session. And for those of you who are watching live or watching the recording, our word of the day is summer. So DM that to our Instagram team for a chance to win some merch. And I will share the spotlight now with Bryan. So thank you so much for joining us today, and let me know when you want me to share your presentation.
You can go ahead and share them now. Thank you, Hannah. Hannah personally is responsible for about $10 billion of my acquisition expenditures, but we won't go there today. No, thanks for joining and giving me an opportunity to discuss with you some topics that are really, I think, important and in some ways near and dear to my heart. So what I really want to focus on today is a discussion around ESG. So many of you might be familiar with that terminology. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And there's an older concept called sustainable development. I'm going to offer you some of my opinions. They're based on experiences, reading I've done, and as you're going to see through the presentation, you know, as all humans, we all accumulate sort of belief systems and biases. And so feel free to agree, disagree. My objective today is really to promote you to think about some things. And I'm hopeful that I can even entice you to read a couple of books that I found extremely interesting and informative for myself. So with that, maybe just next slide, please. So as I said, very topical today. You'll read often in the business section of newspapers, you'll see the terminology ESG. And this is just one chart I found on the internet, and it gives some indication of what's behind each of those letters in the acronym. And at a high level, I'd say it's pretty hard to disagree with this stuff. So environmental, well, who amongst us doesn't care about the environment we live in, preserving nature, being energy efficient, efficiently using water, protecting biodiversity. That sounds pretty good. Who wouldn't be for protecting the environment? And then you look at the social column. Well, equal opportunity, freedom of expression, human rights, protecting the health and safety of workers, not supporting child labor. Sounds pretty non-controversial, at least to someone like myself. And then you look at governance. Well, business ethics, well, that's pretty near and dear to my heart. Compliance with regulations, having boards that are independent so they can exercise the right amount of governance in a corporation, all makes lots of sense. The complexity comes in, though, in how do you balance these things? There's an older concept called sustainable development. There was a fellow named Brundtland, and he headed up a United Nations commission. And way back in the 80s, he came up with the concept of sustainable development, which is very similar to ESG. It talks about economic considerations, ecological or environmental considerations, and social. And the whole point of the model I'm showing you here is there's 3 legs to the stool, and they're all important. And with any 2 legs, you just don't have everything you want for the world to be sustainable. And now the principle of sustainability, at least according to Brundtland, was preserving these things for future generations, but also for current generations. So it was about now and the future. And I thought, again, that sounds pretty good. And who doesn't care about those things? Now the complexity comes in, how do you actually do this in real life? So next slide, please. And Hannah, I don't know what the format is, but if anyone has questions, I don't know if they raise their hands, but if you can help facilitate questions along the way, that'd be great. So now the hard part comes in. So we're all human beings, and I want to introduce to some of you, at least today, the concept of how we as humans think and process information, because how we do that influences how we interpret information that's presented to us in ways that you will have no conscious knowledge of. So a couple of things I want to indicate to you is, first off, the way a situation is described or framed matters a lot in how you interpret it. And so I can take a very broad, big frame or a very narrow frame, and that will influence how you judge a certain situation and how you would prioritize. And the reality is we all make choices, not just intellectually and logically with our minds, but also through emotions. Some of this might make sense to you, some of it might not, and I'm going to give you a couple of references in some of the charts coming on. And I'd really encourage you to be inquisitive and curious about this area. In my business, we invest very large amounts of capital. And it's really important for me to make informed decisions with the best thinking and the best processing of information that we can. And we all have these subconscious biases that influence that thinking. So very important for me to recognize those and also have a diverse group of people around me such that I get a breadth of their experiences and their biases, and that leads to better decision making. Next slide, please. And so the reality is on all these things, it's not black and white. And you folks will know, those of you more involved with SFC, situations are often presented as it's very black or it's very white. Fossil fuels are bad, very black. Fossil fuels are essential and very good, very white. Well, the reality is there's many shades of gray in between, and there's many arms and legs and tentacles to that consideration. And so again, I encourage you to be curious and question things, and just don't take things for black and white, but to interpret them in many shades of gray, because that's the reality. Complex situations, I would suggest to you, are invariably many, many shades of gray. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this slide in great detail, but there was two people, a guy named Daniel Kahneman, and he had a partner, and they did groundbreaking work on cognitive thinking. So how your brain processes information. Kahneman wrote a book on this called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. It's a very big book. It's kind of a bit dense to read. I'd really suggest you should give some consideration to reading it. There's variations on it now. Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for his work. And it turns out, and they've done this, there are many experiments, but our brain processes information very quickly in what he calls type 1 behavior or intuitive behavior. And it goes back to, frankly, when humans were forming and fighting for survival, and so you instinctively reacted to threats. And it's a very fast response of your brain, and it's subject to many biases. It's not logical, and even the most logical people will make illogical decisions and process information illogically. There's another part of your brain that processes very logically, but it tends to work much more slowly, and you have to be very deliberate about engaging that part of your brain. And so I find this area very fascinating when it comes to decision-making and governance, which I'm going to turn to in a few slides. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so many situations, I like to think about it as, is the glass half full or half empty? And so I can give you examples, and I will in a minute. So read the newspapers today, and you could be convinced that, man, we're going to hell in a handbasket, right? Everything is falling apart. It's just dreadful. It's never been worse than it is now. You've got the war in Ukraine. There's issues around climate change. There's inequality. The list goes on and on. And you can read many, if not most newspapers, much of the mainstream media, and you could be convinced that, boy, it's only, the glass is half empty on a good day and often worse than that. And there's others that will tell you, boy, things are good, and look at the progress that humans have made. And the reality is both are true. So next slide, please. Okay, so there's a number of places I've come across that actually take the emotion out of this and have measured many dimensions of humanity. Things like life expectancy, access to education, equality, women's rights, many environmental factors. And the data would actually suggest to you that humanity has never been better off than it is today. And I encourage you, again, there's one website that I really like. It's called Our World in Data. I'll give you some references with a couple of other books. And so you could be a glass half full person and say, by almost all measures, humanity's never been better off than it is today. And then conversely, you could say the world is terrible. Look at it. As I cited, you've got the war, you've got inequality. Boy, it's never been worse. I prefer to think of it as both are true. It is better than it's ever been. And there are issues in front of us, as there always are, and we need to deal with them. I'm personally a believer in human spirit, ingenuity, and the capacity for us to work together to make things better. And so for me, this debate about is it half full or half empty, I think is frankly a waste of time. And I prefer to think about what are the issues in front of us and how do we work together to address them and make the world better. And frankly, the purpose of me being here with you today is to try and foster maybe a few questions, provide you a few things to think about, some of which make sense to you today. Some of those seeds may not germinate for many years, but for me, this is about paying it forward and helping to equip your generation to make the world a better place. Okay, next slide, please. And here's just some of the books. There's a lot of books there now. You can look at any of these. If you're feeling down about the world, pick up one of these and it'll make you feel a lot better about the progress that humanity's made over the time of its existence. Okay, next slide. So a couple of my beliefs. So there was a fellow named Adam Smith, and he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. It's not a recent book. It was written in 1776, so the same year the United States became a country. And there's a famous phrase that you can see here. And Adam Smith said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, etc., that makes our lives better." So I'm just going to paraphrase here. But miraculously, through them each acting in their own vested self-interest, society gets better. And so I will disclose to you, I personally am a strong believer in what he called the invisible hand, that somehow through independent actions of many, many people, each acting for themselves, society does get better. And I think that's been a fundamental element of the advancement of humanity. And it actually works. And it leads to one of my beliefs that where possible, we should decentralize decision-making. So to my eyes, there's a bit of there's a significant political battle now, I think, between people who believe in centralization. So that's big government and the smart people deciding what should be done and how it should be done, and decentralization, where many, many people just acting on their own somehow come up with a better answer. My own bias and belief is that the action of many is better than the direction of a few. And I have had many, many experiences where the power of a team working together is far stronger than even the strongest individual on that team. A second belief for me is that prosperity enables sustainability. And by that, I mean that when we are prosperous, we are more likely to take care of the environment and better equipped to take care of the environment than when we're poor. When you're fighting for survival, truly all you're focused on is survival. And if it causes environmental damage or social damage, you're less concerned because you're just fighting for survival. So fundamental belief for me is prosperity enables sustainability, and the invisible hand is a key element to prosperity. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to turn a little bit to energy now. I'm in the energy business. I've worked in the energy business for over 40 years. And there are a few things that I think are inevitable. The world's population continues to grow, although it is growing at a much slower pace. And I would suggest to you that the peak population of the Earth will be far lower than is indicated by some of the United Nations projections. There's a book called, sorry, the name's escapes me now. There's a fellow named Daryl Bricker. Anyway, they have documented the decline in growth rates in basically all advanced countries now, and starting to mitigate population growth even in the developing world. So population will grow, albeit at a slower rate than it has in the past. And everyone is striving for an improved living standard, particularly in the developing world. Offsetting that demand growth from more people wanting more energy for a better standard of living is we're getting better at energy efficiency. So we can get more done with less energy today than ever before. But in my mind, it's unequivocal that the global demand for energy will continue to grow. So we need to satisfy not just the current demand, but anticipate and satisfy a growing demand as we move forward. Next slide, please. And here's just some data. I haven't updated this chart for a while, but what it shows you is the growing demand here of hydrocarbons and oil equivalent. And you can see the charts individually. So this is where, you think about thinking fast and thinking slow. You will read about the exponential growth in renewable energy, and it's true. And here's where framing matters. But look at the scale of how much energy is from renewables versus fossil fuels. So historically, fossil fuels have provided 84 to 86% of the world's energy, and that's now down to about 82 or 83%. So despite all the efforts to move towards renewables, it's hardly made a dent thus far in the market share of fossil fuels. Having said that, as energy demand grows, that's being soaked up to a fair amount by renewables, wind, solar, et cetera. So I'm not anti any form of energy, but realistically, I personally have trouble seeing any time in the foreseeable future where the world will not be using fossil fuels, including 2050. And you can read about net zero and all those promises, which I would tell you candidly from my perspective are a fairy tale. Next slide, please. Okay, so this just documents a little bit of my belief that abundant, affordable, and reliable energy enables prosperity. So this is a chart that shows energy usage per capita versus GDP, so gross domestic product. And it seems very clear to me that advanced societies, very prosperous societies, use a lot of energy. And we do. Relative to poor societies. And those poor societies aspire to maybe not achieving our lifestyle, they certainly would aspire to that, but they certainly want a better life than they have currently. Next slide, please. And so the reality when we talk about energy, we take it for granted. I would submit you all take it for granted. When you turn the light switch on, you expect the light to come on. When you go to fill up your car, you expect the gas station to have fuel. You run your fridge and you never even think about how much energy that uses. A statistic I saw recently, so the world's population now is about 7.8 billion people, and now less than 1 billion, but almost 1 billion people have no electricity, none. And over 3 billion use less electricity than your fridge. And so that's what energy poverty is about. And many people cook with primitive fuels. And when I mean primitive, I mean like dung. And you can see the statistic here, over 1 million people a year, it's estimated, die from indoor pollution, not outdoor pollution from driving cars, indoor pollution, smoke pollution from the fuels that they have to use to cook their food. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, this is a little bit dated, 2016, but you look at Africa and there are almost, I think the latest statistics I saw is 800 million people, almost 1 billion people who have no electricity at all. So for me, that's what energy is about. It's not just for our lifestyle, but it's for a world that aspires to a better life too. Next slide. Okay, so coming a little bit closer to home, and this comes into some of my passion for advocacy for our Canadian industry. Since 2006, the United States has grown both its oil and gas production. Again, this slide is a little bit dated, but it's not that they grew more than Canada grew. They grew more than a whole Canada. So the United States growth over, call it 15 years, is bigger than all of what Canada produces in both oil and gas. And so, the question becomes, who's going to supply that world's energy? And it's a two-sided coin for me. The world needs energy. I think we produce it very responsibly here in Canada, and it's to our economic benefit. And so a lot of discussion you'll see is about what fuels will we use? Will we drive electric cars? My candid view is energy for Canada is probably more about what we export than what we use ourselves. And this is far and away Canada's largest export. And exports underpin, and our balance of payments underpins the value of the Canadian dollar. So if you stop exporting, you're going to look at a Canadian dollar that's worth a lot less. And if you think food and fruit and vegetables are expensive now, imagine them costing 2 or 3 times as much if we had a weaker Canadian dollar. So to me, energy is important for the world and it's important for Canada. And it's the wealth that's created through our resources industries, not just oil and gas, but all the resource industries that SFC advocates for. And this is what creates the prosperity that pays for the things that we care about: healthcare, education, social programs. So this, for me, if you want sustainability, you need prosperity. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just summing up a few of my beliefs about energy, I think human progress is demonstrable across almost everything you can measure. I believe that free markets, free enterprise, property laws give a framework where human ingenuity can do its thing. And I believe prosperity depends on clean, affordable, reliable energy. The global demand for energy is going to grow. Perhaps controversially, I would tell you that current technologies cannot replace fossil fuels in the foreseeable future. And that's not just me saying it. Even when you look inside the scenarios of people who have net zero scenarios, they all rely on technologies that currently don't exist. So I just tell you that there is no known path today to net zero tomorrow. Not saying we shouldn't try, not showing we can't have that aspiration, but we need to be realistic about what it's going to cost and timeframes to achieve that. I do believe that more options for energy, how we generate it, move it around and use it, is better for humans. So the more energy, the better. And I also think that focusing on conservation efficiency is critical to us having a good future for your generation and those to come. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a little bit closer to home now. So that's my macro framing. And I just want to talk about my company a little bit. Not because it's particularly important to you, but I think it illustrates that this stuff can be done. And I really want to lead you with how it can be done. So I personally do not like the ESG model. My view is that governance is about good decision-making, how we assess and manage risks, how we allocate our resources, and how we make choices. And what I tell people is, in my company, and I would submit in every company, I don't have workers coming in saying, Monday's environment day and Tuesday's social day and Thursday and Friday are profit day. It's all integrated, and every activity has dimensions of environmental, social, and economic impact. So we manage it kind of as a whole, holistically, not as individual pieces. And for me, what ties it all together is governance. And frankly, that's my job. So I'm the chief governance officer, if you like, because that's where it all comes together. And a controversial statement I will make: a lot of companies have chief sustainability officers. I think that's the wrong model. My view is the CEO has to be the chief sustainability officer, because that's where all these considerations come together. A couple of things that I'm particularly proud of. So we've got lots of measures of profitability. You don't need to concern yourself or worry about those, but I'm pretty proud that I've built a very profitable company. On the environmental side, we have top decile greenhouse gas emissions intensities. So there's very few companies that are lower than us. We've done a lot to abandon and reclaim legacy well sites. We've shown leadership working with First Nations on restoring fish habitats. So we do lots of this stuff. And we never do it through ESG. We do it through our corporate governance. And then what I'm particularly proud of is the work we've been doing with First Nations in the last few years. One of the bands that we interact with significantly, it's called the Capoeino First Nation. They have discovered, so they had a residential school on their reserve, and they are in the process of now uncovering grave sites of children. You guys have all read about it in the newspaper. We read about it in the newspaper last year and invited the chief to just come and talk to us about what was going on for the First Nation. So Chief Halcrow honored us. He came to Calgary and we spent a day just talking about their experience. We had no agenda, no business agenda. We just said, you're our neighbors. We're appalled by what happened in the past. And we just want to understand and know that as your neighbors, you have friends. So that led to ongoing discussions. And recently, we were up announcing an endowment fund. So our company has created an educational endowment to support a school that the Capoeino run for all the bands in the area. And the intent is for them to be able to teach their culture and language for future generations. We didn't do that because outside forces told us to do it. We did it because we thought it was the right thing to do and it fit with our corporate culture. We have another initiative with a band called the Paul Band, and we've helped them create a brand new company that they own 100% to do abandonment and well reclamations, which we think is going to be a growing business opportunity. You can see some pictures. So we were up meeting with the chief and the Indigenous Affairs Minister last week, just making sure that initiative is on the go. My point here being that if you have strong governance in a company, the rest basically gets taken care of. You have the right corporate culture, the right behaviors, the right allocation of resources, and it's through that lens that I think about ESG, environmental, economic, and social considerations. Next slide. Yeah, so kind of my mental model is governance here is it's through governance that you achieve your objectives in people, planet, and profit. Okay, in the interest of time, just a couple of closing slides. Okay, so I'm going to encourage you to think about some of what I've had to say. You can agree, you can disagree. I hope some of it provokes you and your inquisitiveness to read and learn a little bit more. But I would like to leave you with a couple of messages. One is ignorance is bliss, right up until the end, and then it's too late. So I think you're all engaged here, and I hope you can learn a little bit before it's too late. And last slide, please. You know, this can seem daunting to you. I know you're all young, you're thinking about your careers and lots and lots of things. But every accomplishment starts with the decision to try. I applaud you all for being involved with SFC. That is starting, you have made the decision to try. And I hope this today gives you a little bit of food for thought. And I'm happy to take any questions, comments, and any of you that want to follow up with conversations at any time, you can reach out through Miss Hannah, and she knows how to get a hold of me. With that, I'm going to close and just see if you have any questions that you'd like me to answer today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your presentation and giving some of your personal experience and opinions. So really appreciate it.